The Vethrani didn't have a word for simultaneously. This wasn't a translation gap. It was a cognitive architecture. Their brains, 3 lobes arranged in a slow-rotating sequence, each one active for roughly 4 seconds before handing control to the next, process a universe in shifts. One thought completed, then the next, always in clean, unbroken sequence. They had built an entire civilization on this. Their music played one note at a time, each one held until it meant something. Their architecture was designed so that no doorway ever revealed 2 rooms at once. Their legal system prohibited presenting more than one argument per session, not out of tradition, but because a Vethrani judge physically could not weigh 2 things in parallel. The brain simply didn't work that way. They were not lesser for it. They had mapped 4-star systems, cured 11 categories of cellular decay, and constructed a philosophical tradition so internally consistent that 3 other species had adopted it wholesale. They were brilliant, methodical, and exact. They just couldn't do 2 things at once. So when the Vethrani Interspecies Coalition published its Codex of Combat Limitations, a document meant to catalog the biological constraints of every registered species to prevent unfair matchups in the arbitration rings, they wrote, under their own entry, dual instrument engagement, impossible. Neural architecture prevents parallel motor command. And because the Vethrani wrote the Codex, and because the Vethrani assumed that what was true of themselves was the ceiling rather than one point on a spectrum, the entry for every other species read the same. Dual instrument engagement, impossible. Coalition, standard. Nobody corrected them, not the rule, who had 4 arms but used them in careful sequence out of cultural habit. Not the Salvine, who theoretically could but considered it grotesque showmanship. Not the 32 other species who read the Codex and assumed someone smarter had already done the math. The Codex became law. The law became assumption. The assumption became, over 200 years, something that felt indistinguishable from physics. Until the morning Mara Voss walked into the arbitration ring on Station Kevdolan, carrying a short blade in each hand, and the entire arena went so quiet that you could hear the ventilation cycling. She was 26 and had been living on Kevdolan for 3 years, which was long enough to have learned 6 words of Vethrani click speech, and short enough that she still found the food genuinely upsetting. She worked as a hull calibration technician, which meant she spent most of her time in narrow access corridors doing math that nobody else wanted to do. She was not, by any reasonable assessment, a warrior. She had no military background. She had grown up in a small city in central Pennsylvania, where the most violent thing she'd regularly witnessed was high school wrestling. But she had trained with blades since she was 11 years old, not for combat, but because her grandmother had been a practitioner of a Filipino martial art called eskrima and had taught Mara the way some grandmothers teach baking, as a form of love expressed through repetition. 2 sticks first, then training blades, then, eventually, real ones, though they never spar with those. It was about the movement. Her grandmother always said, about teaching the body to think in pairs, left and right not as opposites, but as conversation, one always answering the other. Mara had kept training after her grandmother died. It was the only thing that felt like grief made physical, muscle memory as memorial. She trained in her quarters on Kevdolan, in the maintenance bay after hours, anywhere she could find 4 feet of clearance. She had entered the arbitration ring by accident. That is, she had been watching about between a rural contractor and a Salvine navigator, a standard territorial dispute, settled by coalition law through single combat, non-lethal refereed. When the rule's second, a human man named Cole, had broken his hand in a pre-match equipment check. Cole had grabbed her from the observation deck because she was the only other human in the building, and the rules required a registered second of matching species. "You don't have to fight," Cole had told her, cradling his hand. "You're just a body on the roster." That had been 20 minutes ago. Now she was standing in the ring because the rural contractor had been disqualified for a procedural violation, and in the resulting legal chaos. Someone had nominated Mara as his replacement, and she had said yes before she fully understood what she was agreeing to. She was holding both her training blades, the ones she brought from home, the ones her grandmother had given her, because she'd been holding them when Cole found her and hadn't had anywhere to put them down. The Vethrani referee stared at her from across the sand. His name was Ovithkar, and he had been officiating bouts for 30 years. He had seen humans fight before. He had never seen one carrying 2 weapons simultaneously, because the Codex said it wasn't possible, and in 30 years, the Codex had never been wrong. He looked at his tablet. He looked at Mara. He looked at his tablet again. "Competitor," he said, through the translator bead clipped to his collar. "You are holding 2 instruments." "Yeah," Mara said. "Simultaneously," he said, as though the word tasted strange. "That's generally how 2 works," she said. The bout was paused for 47 minutes while Ovithkar consulted the Codex. Mara sat on a bench at the ring's edge and drank water from a bottle, and watched the Vethrani officials cluster around their tablets with the focused anxiety of people discovering that gravity might be negotiable. Her opponent, a Salvine named Threshuval, tall and pale-plated, with the slow, confident movements of someone who had won every arbitration bout for the past 6 years, watched her from across the ring with what she was learning to read as Salvine curiosity. A slight forward tilt of the cranial ridge, secondary eyes half open. She'd been briefed on Salvine fighting style in the 10 panic minutes before entering. Single weapon, disciplined, highly technical. They trained for years. They were very good. She was not thinking about winning. She was thinking about whether she'd remember to log her maintenance hours before Cole had grabbed her, and whether the ventilation unit in Corridor 7G had been the one making the clicking noise, or if that was 7F. Cole appeared beside her, hand wrapped, expression unreadable. "They're arguing about whether you're disqualified," he said. "For holding 2 swords? For violating a species limitation listed in the Codex." Mara turned to look at him. "It's my hands. They're attached to my body. How is that a violation?" "The Codex says dual instrument engagement is impossible for all registered species. That's not a rule. That's just them being wrong." "I know," Cole said, "but they wrote the Codex." She thought about that. There was something in it that reminded her of a feeling she'd had often as a child. The discovery that an authority's certainty and an authority's correctness were 2 entirely different things, and that the world was full of people who had confused them. Her grandmother had told her something once, during a training session, when Mara had complained that using both hands simultaneously felt unnatural. "It feels unnatural because you were taught to think of your hands as separate," her grandmother had said. "Teach them to be a system. Then it feels like breathing." Mara flexed her fingers around the grips. Left and right. Conversation. Across the arena. Ovithkar looked up from his tablet with the expression of a man whose floor had just become the ceiling. They didn't disqualify her. The legal architecture wouldn't allow it. The Codex listed dual instrument engagement as impossible, not prohibited, because no one had ever imagined it needed to be prohibited. You don't write a rule against something you believe cannot happen. It was the same reason Vethrani building codes contained nothing about doorways that revealed 2 rooms simultaneously. Unimaginable things leave no legislative footprint. Ovithkar made 3 separate calls to coalition legal offices, each conversation more strained than the last. Mara heard fragments through the translator bead he'd left open by mistake. "The document doesn't account for no. There is no precedent because the assumption was that. I understand that, but the human is standing there with..." Finally, he walked back to the center of the ring and announced, in a voice of profound official discomfort, that the bout would proceed. Threshuval didn't look concerned. Salvine's composure was architectural. It wasn't that they suppressed emotion. It was that their emotional processing happened in a deep internal layer that rarely surfaced unless they chose it. What Mara saw was a fighter who had won dozens of bouts and had been told that her opponent was a hull technician who had ended up here by clerical accident, which was, Mara acknowledged, accurate. The Salvine drew a single long blade, silvery and slightly curved, and held in her dominant right hand with the ease of something she'd done 10,000 times. The bell rang. Threshuval moved the way water moves around a stone, smooth, inevitable, finding the path of least resistance. She was reading Mara's body for the dominant hand, for the lead weapon, for the logical threat axis. This was how you fought someone with 2 weapons. You identified which one was real and which was distraction, and you shut down the real one. The problem, Mara's grandmother had taught her, was that there was no fake hand in Eskrima. They were both real. The whole point was that they were both real. You didn't have a dominant weapon and a supporting weapon. You had a system, and the system didn't have a weak side. Mara moved first, not aggressively, but in the way that her training had always started. Not with a strike, but with a shift, angling offline, and both blades moving at slightly different rhythms, one high and drawing attention, one low and patient. Threshuval blocked the high blade, and was already reading the low one, when it wasn't where she expected it to be, because Mara's left hand had changed the angle mid-motion, responding to the block, which was something a single-weapon fighter does not do because a single-weapon fighter is making one decision at a time. The solvine reset, recalculated. In the observation tier above, a Vethrani analyst was already opening a new document. Mara did not win easily. This is important. Threshuval was exceptional. 6 years of arbitration victories meant 6 years of continuous learning, and the solvine adapted mid-fight in ways that surprised Mara twice. Once badly enough that she took a clean strike to the shoulder that would bruise magnificently by morning. But the thing that was happening in the ring was not primarily a fight. It was a vocabulary problem. Threshuval had trained in a system built around a specific grammar. Subject, verb, object. Weapon goes here. Block goes there. Counter goes here. It was an elegant grammar, internally consistent, and she spoke it beautifully. Mara was speaking a language with different syntax. Subject, subject, verb, verb. Both hands always mid-sentence, each one completing the other's thought. It wasn't chaos. It was compound structure. Threshuval could read one sentence at a time. She was very fast at it, but she was encountering 2 sentences simultaneously, and her training had no framework for parsing them together. She kept trying to identify the primary threat, and found that every time she did, the geometry of primary had quietly moved. The bout ended in the 19th minute, not with a dramatic blow, with a bind, both of Mara's blades crossing Threshuval's wrist and throat simultaneously, light pressure, clearly controlled. The referee called it silence. Then something Mara had never heard in an arena. Not cheering, not the expected response of crowd. A sound she couldn't name. Later, Cole would describe it as the noise a room makes when everyone in it is revising something they believed was fixed. He found her in the corridor behind the ring, still holding her blades, not quite ready to put them away. Ovithkar was older than she'd realized up close. His skin plates had the faded, layered look of age, and he moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned to conserve. He stood at what she'd learned was Vethrani polite distance, which was farther than humans usually stood. "May I ask you something?" he said. Not a question in his inflection, a request. "Sure," Mara said. "When you use the 2 instruments, are you making 2 decisions, or 1 decision?" She thought about it seriously. "One," she said. "It's 1 decision, but it has 2 parts that happen at the same time." His secondary processing lobe, visible as a slight pulse beneath the skin at his temple, flickered. "We do not have a word for that," he said. "I know," she said. It didn't feel like a victory. "The codex was written from our experience," he said. "We did not intend it as a cage." "I know that too," she said. "I don't think you were trying to limit anyone. I think you were describing your world and forgot that other people live in different ones." He was quiet for a long time in a Vethrani way, which meant he was genuinely processing, all 3 lobes cycling through the thought in sequence. "Is it frightening?" he finally asked. 2 thoughts at once. Mara looked at her hands, thought about her grandmother's kitchen, the sound of 2 sticks in rhythm, the specific piece of a body that had learned to be a system. "No," she said. "It feels like breathing." The solvine found her before she left the station. This was unusual. Arbitration bouts were legal proceedings. Once resolved, the parties typically separated without social ritual. But Threshuval was waiting near the transit bay with her blade already sheathed and her cranial ridge tilted in that way Mara now recognized as curiosity. "I want to understand what you did," Threshuval said, not to counter it, to understand it. Mara sat down on a transit bench. "What's confusing about it?" "I have trained for 16 years, Threshuval said. "In those 16 years, every opponent I have faced has had a logic I could learn, a primary axis, a preferred response, a shape." She paused. "You didn't have a shape I could find." "Because the shape was in the relationship between my hands," Mara said. "Not in either one." The Solvine was still. "We have a concept," she said slowly. "In our philosophy, Velsaruth, it means roughly the meaning that lives between two things, not in either thing itself." Mara felt something shift in her chest. "That's exactly it," she said. "We use it as a philosophical idea," Thresuvel said. "Abstract. We never thought it could be a physical practice." They sat with that for a moment. The transit bay hummed around them, ships arriving and departing, the ordinary noise of a station that didn't know anything unusual had happened today. "I didn't come here to change anything," Mara said. "I want you to know that. I was just holding my grandmother's blades." "I know," Thresuvel said. "That's what makes it real." 3 weeks later, Mara was back in Corridor 7G. It had been 7G making the clicking noise, not 7F, when Cole forwarded her a message from a coalition legal archive. A formal petition had been filed to revise the codex, not just the dual-weapon entry. The entire framework section titled Species Limitations, which had been written by Vethrani scholars in the coalition's founding period and never substantially revised. The petition was filed by Ovithkar. His argument, she read it 3 times, because the translation software had trouble with Vethrani philosophical syntax, was not that the codex had been wrong. It was that the codex had made a structural error in category. It had listed biological facts under the heading limitations, as though a fact about one species' experience was automatically a ceiling on all experience, as though absence of thing in the known data meant absence of the thing in the world. He proposed a new section heading, Species Particularities, things that were true but not universal, descriptions, not boundaries. It was, Mara thought, a quiet revolution, not loud, not proud, not a statement about who was better or worse or more capable, just an honest correction to a category error that had been running unchecked for 200 years. She sat in Corridor 7G for a long time, listening to a ventilation unit that was no longer clicking, because she'd fixed it 2 weeks ago, and thought about the difference between a wall and a description of a wall, and how often in her life she had stopped at descriptions believing them to be walls. Then she picked up her calibration tools and went back to work. 6 months later, Thresuvel sent her a message. It was brief. Solvine correspondence usually was. They considered lengthy messages a kind of imposition, as though taking up too much of someone's attention was a form of debt. "I have been practicing." It read, "Not dual weapons. I do not have the physiology for your specific system, but I have been practicing Velsaruth as physical form, learning to generate meaning in the relationship between movements rather than in the movements themselves. It is very difficult. I wanted you to know that I think your grandmother understood something important." Mara read it in her quarters, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her blades laid out in front of her the way she always laid them out before training. Parallel, a match pair, the way her grandmother had taught her to treat them, not as 2 weapons but as one system with 2 expressions. She thought about Ovithkar revising the codex, about Thresuvel learning a new grammar in middle age, about a 200-year-old document that had meant no harm and caused it anyway, not through malice but through the simple human and apparently universal error of assuming your own experience was the shape of all possible experience. She wrote back. She did. She also made very good pierogi. "I miss her." Then she stood up, picked up both blades, and began, left hand moving, right hand answering. Not 2 things happening simultaneously. One thing with 2 parts, like breathing.